would you please check your ideas and opinions at the door? All your philosophical and religious views, all your logic, because I say check it at the door advisedly because you can pick it up again when you go out if you feel unsafe without it. I'm not trying to argue you out of your opinions and views. I'm merely suggesting that for the sake of an experiment, you temporarily suspend them.
Hello and welcome to the Philosophical Minds podcast, an exploration of all things philosophical, alchemical, and esoteric, from the psycho-spiritual to the material-chemical nature of the all. Join me and my guests as we inquire into the liminality of mind and matter, and tend to the fertile soils of awareness and perception while facilitating an expanded consciousness from the individual to the collective. If you enjoy the show and find it of value, consider supporting and becoming a patron via the Patreon at patreon.com/philosophicalminds. A small contribution makes a big difference and definitely makes it easier for me to continue the show, although I will always do my best to keep it flowing regardless. Thank you all, and let's get into it. All right, tonight I am joined with Esoteric Eddie, author and independent scholar. How are you doing tonight?
Doing all right, doing okay.
Awesome.
As we were saying there before, just a little heavy-hearted. I found out that Jordan Maxwell has passed away.
Yeah,
So
rough news.
RIP to the legend. But other than that, it's been an all right week.
Awesome. I'm excited to talk to you. You got an important book that I want to get into, but I thought it'd be cool first, because it's a fun subject for me personally, as you as well, I think, is I would like to touch on the Anunnaki and maybe a little bit of your insight with that. I know that I was just listening to one of a recent podcast that you had done. You guys were going pretty deep into it, and it was really cool. So I wanted to ask you some questions about the overall story as you have come to know it, in terms of who you've read, like the primary resources and the sources that you've derived your knowledge from in terms of the Anunnaki and who they were and what they were all about. And yeah, so if you could just kind of give a little bit of insight into that, and then I'll ask you a few questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I first heard about the Anunnaki when I was in high school. So this was like back in like 2009. And it blew my mind coming across this, especially coming from like a Christian background and whatnot. Uh, um, but the first person that I came across was Zecharia Sitchin. I'm sure you may be familiar with him, or the audience may be familiar with him, but Zecharia Sitchin was the author or the scholar that actually brought the Anunnaki concept or theory to the world. Before him, the ancient alien theory was touched on by other people, such as Eric von Daniken, but he is the one to have actually brought the Anunnaki to us, primarily through his Earth Chronicles series. It's about like 7 or 9 books, and he put together and theorized this idea of all of ancient cultures being connected by this idea of the gods coming down here and creating man and giving us knowledge, and then there being this worldwide flood that happened, and then after that mankind was given the responsibility or opportunity to rule instead of the gods, and then carry on this great lineage. And that's when the secret societies were formed, and priesthoods and religions, and here we are today with all this occultism. So Zecharia Sitchin, in my mind, is the pioneer, is the legendary, starter of all of that. And then after him, a lot of people started coming out and kind of following his work. Some people did their own unique, research. Some other notable authors that I've come across is William Bromley. He wrote a book called The Gods of Eden. He's been featured on like Ancient Aliens and stuff like that. He's pretty up there as well. But he kind of his view is a little different than Sitchin. He's more like these gods are I guess you can say demonic or sinister. Sitchin's work was very academic. He was just showing us the historical side of things. And then Bromley, he called them the custodial gods. So instead of the Anunnaki, he called them the custodial gods. And pretty much in his viewpoint, it's like we're slaves, right? Is that we're just slaves to these beings. And other notable people, of course, would be like Matthew LaCroix, who's a younger of the two, but is now pretty big in the community, doing his stuff on Gaia TV and whatnot. Other than those three, there's been many other like smaller people or people more underground people such as myself trying to do the work and bring that to light. But those are some of the more notable people that I've come across, and of course David Icke, but he was more so like along the lines of the political aspect of it, where it is today and what it means for us today in the political realm that we're in. And of course, RIP, Jordan Maxwell as well. Jordan Maxwell touched on the Anunnaki and the gods. And again, he was more along the lines of that, we're slaves to this system. We're slaves to the institution that the Anunnaki had set up long, long ago, and that we should not view them as our creator, but only our sinister elder brothers and sisters who might have had good intentions, but kind of left us in a bad place.
Yeah, I was wondering your thoughts on, or if you have heard of, it's somebody that I had heard Matthew LaCroix bring up multiple times, George Smith. 'Cause it was my understanding he was one of the first people historically that were on record to translate the Sumerian Akkadian cuneiform tablets. So apparently there's like a shit ton of tablets found in the library of Ashurbanipal, I think it was, in somewhere in the mid 1800s. So there's this account, I think it's the Chaldean account of Genesis work by George Smith. So yeah, I was wondering, because and then there's something else that I had learned that I was listening to a podcast of yours, where I think you were talking about Sitchin, and actually he did have an earlier source that he referenced, which was a rabbi. So I was wondering if you were familiar with George Smith and his work, and then if you could maybe speak a little bit to that rabbi that you had referenced, that had kind of sparked off Sitchin's work.
Yeah, absolutely. I have heard of George Smith. I have yet to study his life and his efforts in detail, but I know who he is, and I know that I remember reading a small excerpt about him and something else saying that he was deciphering this stuff, and then he had like a eureka moment where he was suddenly reading the Noah flood story, but it's thousands of years older, and he was kind of like freaking out. And I guess the story is he was like running up and down some museum or thing, and he's just like, you guys, like, you have to read this. And then so it was like a mind blowing for him. And so yeah, he gave us the it's known as also as the Chaldean Genesis, because back then they called Sumer or Iraq Chaldea, or the Chaldeans, also known as the Babylonians, because they didn't have a term for the Sumerians yet. But yeah, I know George Smith, and then two other people that I'm familiar with that have influenced my work are the pioneers of Assyriology, Samuel Noah Kramer, and also Henry Austin Laird, or it might be Austin Henry Laird. But they were like early onset Assyriologists who also wrote extensively on the Sumerians and gave us a lot of prime source material on what they were actually saying to us and stuff, and deciphering that stuff for us. So yeah, Samuel Kramer and Henry Laird, also two huge names in early Assyriology. As far as the other person you mentioned, I remember now. Yeah, the rabbi who influenced Sitchin. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I had come across this in an interview that Sitchin did with Elizabeth Clare Prophet, who was also like a famous author. She's more along the lines of like New Age stuff. She was a clairvoyant, but she actually has a really good book on the Book of Enoch, where she kind of gives you translations and her commentaries on it. But she had a show, I guess, back in the day. I don't know if it was like the 70s or 80s, but there's an interview with Sitchin, and he tells his story when he was a schoolboy and how he got into the studies. And the thing about Judaism is there were early commentators on the Torah, and those early commentators are viewed as, very significant. They're very significant within Judaism and that institution. And some of the Torah, or some of the teachings in Judaism, are based on the commentaries rather than the Torah. So one of those commentators was a dude by the name of Malbim. Super really long name, but that's a short version of it, Malbim. And Sitchin says in the interview that in Malbim's commentary on the Genesis story and the Nephilim, is that these beings were actually extraterrestrials, who had descended on Earth and kind of went against God's will and mated with humans and created an offspring. So that commentary actually influenced Sitchin to start thinking in that way, and then he started just going off on all his research and bring real evidence to that.
Was Mel Beam primarily sourcing Hebrew or Aramaic texts, or was he also deriving some of his knowledge from cuneiforms?
I don't know, but I could imagine that he was probably just sticking to the Torah. Being that he was a rabbi and a commentator on the Torah, he was probably just sticking strictly to that. But I could be wrong, and it's something worth looking into.
Yeah, super cool though. Um, and then you had mentioned the Book of Enoch. I've listened to a little bit about the Book of Enoch. I haven't. I don't think I've fully listened to it, but so I'm not like super deep or familiar, but it's really interesting to me, and I was wondering if you could kind of give like a brief overview of what the Book of Enoch is all about, who was Enoch, and how that kind of ties in with things.
Yeah, okay. So Enoch in the Bible is okay. So Enoch in the Bible was the grandfather of Noah. And in the Bible, he's mentioned like very briefly. It just says that Enoch lived 365 days, and then the Lord took him. Like Enoch is one of the few people in the Bible, along with Elijah and Jesus, kind of, who didn't die on earth, who were taken up to heaven directly. And so that's all the Bible says about Enoch. It says Enoch lived 365 days. He begat his son Lamech, who then would go on to birth Noah, and then he just disappeared. God took him. But early on in the Hellenistic period, a couple hundred years before Jesus, there was a book of Enoch that was circulating, and we don't know exactly how far back that story goes. I think the oldest version that we have goes back to like 200 AD, but legends of it go back to like 200 BC. And the the Book of Enoch is a more extensive tale on Enoch. And J.T. Millick wrote the most extensive scholarly piece on the Book of Enoch in the 70s. And what he concluded was that the story in the Bible about Enoch and the fallen angels is actually a summarization of the Book of Enoch, that the Book of Enoch preceded that story. Scholars debate that all the time to this day. But the actual contents, the reason why it's controversial and the reason why the church later took it out of the canonical text, was because it speaks on fallen angels being physical beings. So the Book of Enoch was regarded as canon for a couple hundred years, and then once Jesus came, and then we had the Council of Nicaea later on in the 4th century, which put together and handpicked what books would go in the Bible. They decided to exclude the Book of Enoch, but some Gnostic groups decided to keep that as canon and as factual and true. And to this day, the only Christian Orthodox church that considers it canon is actually the Orthodox Church of Ethiopia. So they actually have some of the oldest Christian churches, some of the oldest Judaic or sects, still in existence. But so the reason the church doesn't like it and the reason why it was taken out is because, again, that idea of fallen angels being these physical beings. So in the story, Enoch is visited by good angels, by the angel Oriel, I believe, and a couple other, and they take him around to heaven and all these different, and show him these different secrets and signs. And then at the same time, these bad fallen angels descend upon earth and conspire together to go and take wives and basically kidnap, females, and just cause ruckus on earth and mate with these women and teach mankind, these different sacred sciences, which some would say are the occult sciences. And then Enoch is prophesied to by the angels and told that he must warn his people about this seed line and warn his people about this cataclysm that's going to be coming to wipe out that seed line. And then as he prophesies for some time, he's then taken up to heaven by these angels. And then the offspring of the Nephilim or fallen angels is becoming rampant. And then the gods or God comes and tries to eliminate that lineage. So it's an extensive, detailed version of the short few verses we have in the Bible about the Nephilim and the flood and Noah. And the book of Enoch was so highly regarded in ancient times that some of Jesus's sayings are actually references to the book of Enoch. And it is said, as I learned in Elizabeth Clare Prophet's book, that first apparently Paul, the Apostle Paul, used to carry around the book of Enoch as like a pocketbook. And the book of Jude in the Bible quotes directly, word for word, from the book of Enoch and states that it is doing so. So it was obviously highly regarded in ancient times. And what I like to say is, if Enoch was real, or at least the book of Enoch was real, then it makes sense that it was highly regarded by people like Paul and Jesus and Jude, because Enoch, as we know, was the grandfather of Noah. So of course we would want to read that and pay attention to that. But the later church excluded it, and it's left us with some mysteries.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. Is there any cuneiform translations or Sumerian myths that parallel and tie in with the Book of Enoch?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I mean, pretty much the whole Sumerian mythology is that of the Book of Enoch to an extent, right? I mean, if we, as Sitchin did, um, if we take a look at all the old world mythologies, that's this, we get the same story being told everywhere, whether it's in the Americas, in Africa, even in China, the Middle East. I mean, wherever on this earth, you'll run into a story, being told by the elders that long, long ago, these gods, by different names, came here, and ruled for some time by themselves, and then decided to create humans, and then try to create a civilization with the humans, where the humans would be subjugated as like the lower class and the gods would be the upper class. And then a cataclysm occurred, or even wars occurred, right? As like the Bhagavad Gita tells us. And even in Sumerian cuneiforms, we hear things about wars. So these cataclysms happen, and then pretty much whole cities or civilizations are wiped out. And then it is decided at that time period that the gods are just going to take off, and they start to vanish. And it is from that point forward that mankind starts to kind of take the reins and take responsibility. And then that's when all the world religions start to pop up, because instead of being in direct connect with the gods, all we now have is their tradition and their memory. So we went from having the gods here physically with us to now trying to worship them and remember them through institutions, the institution of religion. That is definitely expressed in the Sumerian stories time and time again.
Is the individual Enoch, does Enoch go by a different name in the Sumerian myths?
Yeah. So what Sitchin did, and it's not something that I have done yet, but I would like to do, is he tries to trace which Sumerian counterpart is that of different characters in other religions. And I think, I can't remember who he said Enoch was in the Sumerian stories, because for Sitchin, basically he says that the Old Testament, right, was actually just a different version of Sumerian stories, and some of these characters are just being renamed and recycled. And I don't remember exactly who Enoch was in the Sumerian counterpart of it, but
Yeah.
there is one.
I know two big names are, of course, Enlil and Enki.
Yeah.
Are there any parallels that you'd be able to make with Enlil and Enki in relation to anything that people would maybe be familiar with biblically?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I just published a book last December titled "The Lucifer Mystery Revealed," and the whole entire book centers around the character Lucifer, and I kind of like show how that deity, or the concept of that deity, progressed from its inception to now through the church and the occult. And in the book, I pretty much conclude, as other people have, that Enki is actually Lucifer, and it's not that simple. It's a complex, it's a complex, you know, process to get to that understanding. But and the reason being is this. So what we do know is for sure that the biblical story of the flood is based on the Sumerian version. The Sumerian version is the obvious prime source for the world flood myth. There might be an older one, but as of right now, the oldest one we have available to us is the Sumerian story. So if we take that frame of mind into consideration, that the flood story is actually a Sumerian story, and we can kind of start to see who these characters are in the Bible in the Sumerian tales. For example, in the flood story in the Bible, it's one God who is capriciously, debating on killing mankind through this flood, uh, and then saving one line or one family. And the reason why you have that split hesitancy is because it was actually based on the Sumerian story, where there wasn't one God, but two gods, Enki and Enlil, who are brothers in the Sumerian pantheon. And in the Sumerian story, it was Enlil, the more militant, combative, vindictive Anunnaki, who was regretful that we were created, who wants to wipe us out. And then in the Sumerian story, it was Enki, the clever, witty, wise scientist who was always sympathetic to us, who went against his brother's orders and decided to save us by warning one of his actual human offspring, who was known as Zia Sudra, and by the Sumerian name, and I believe Atrahasis by the Akkadian name. So some would say that Enlil is Yahweh. Enlil is the Yahweh character in the Garden of Eden story, who's wants us to be kept in this zoological, environment. And then Enki is the Lucifer character who wants to give us knowledge, help us grow.
Yeah, and then I'm also curious. I don't know if there's any connections that you've um, been able to make with, because there's a figure in the biblical figure of, I think it's Baal or Baal, which is kind
Yeah.
of a big one. I don't know if there's any characters that maybe parallel with with Baal that you're aware of.
Yeah. So Baal is primarily talked about in like Babylonian tales, um, and Canaanite tales. But some people have said that Baal is akin to Marduk, and Marduk was Enki's son. And Marduk in Sumerian lore and in Babylonian lore, he was very like hell bent to rule, and was just always kind of complaining to Enki about like wanting his time to rule to come quicker, because in those days the gods were assigned to certain ages. And this is kind of where like astro theology kind of plays a part. as well, because for some reason the Anunnaki, they were assigned to different constellations, and they were allowed to rule during their constellation sign. And Marduk's sign was that of Aries, the ram. So he was always like hell bent to rule during his, wanting his constellation to come and this whole thing. And Baal is kind of the same way in the text. He's just always, well, actually, the tale of Baal in the Canaanite mythology is kind of showing a transition of power, because by the time Baal becomes powerful, the olden gods are kind of being phased out. So what we're seeing with Baal is a new power rising, a new mythology rising, a new god rising to power and shadowing the old gods. So, I mean, in my eyes, the only person that Baal really correlates with in the Sumerian lore is Marduk, because Marduk was the last of the original Anunnaki to rule. After him, it was all kind of like, half human, half god people.
Yeah, so then I guess, yeah, if Enki and Enlil are brothers, that's interesting. I guess that would make Baal or Baal or Marduk Yahweh's nephew then.
Yeah, yeah, it's just all a big family affair, dude. They must have some pretty awkward Thanksgivings,
For sure.
you know?
That's
But
funny.
man, the genealogy and the family tree of it is it's complex, and it's some people have put it all together. It's honestly something that I have not put together myself, but it is something that I'm going to be doing for myself, because Sitchin has done it, and there are a couple other people who have done it. I'm sure Matthew LaCroix has done it, but some people come up with different interpretations. And for me, the reason why I haven't really done it is because I feel like it's just kind of a game of telephone, right? Like I just kind of stick to the Sumerian. Everything else is kind of just, to me, it's just they're renditions. They're fanatical renditions of the Sumerian tales. But if we were taking the story for true, as Sitchin does, he believes that Baal or El or Yahweh or all these characters aren't just fictitious renditions, that they are actually these gods living through these times and changing their names and as culture progresses.
Yeah. And then Enki, would that kind of correspond with Tahuti or Thoth?
Now that one I have a little information on. So, and Sitchin is pretty much my authority on this, and I
Hmm.
got no shame in my game. But if you also read some of the Assyriologists, they come to the same conclusions too. They came to some of the same conclusions as Sitchin, 100 years before he did. Like E.O. James is another author, another scholar. E.O. James, I think he's in the 20th century, but he wrote extensively about the Anunnaki gods from an academic perspective, and just like the many other Assyriologists, he concludes Enki just unanimously is the god of wisdom, the god represented by serpent, this and that. And so, as far as Toth, Tahuti, it seems as if he's actually the Sumerian god Ningishita. Ningishita meaning he of the tree of life, which he's a prominent figure in the Sumerian tales. And in some tales, he's like Enki's son. In other tales, it appears that he's like Enki's brother or something. That's another complex that we have with looking into these past stories, is sometimes they're like the genealogies change. Sometimes it's their brothers, other times their son and father, but nonetheless, Toth lines up with Ningishita, he of the tree of life, who was Enki's son, who helped Enki in his scientific endeavors pass consciousness to mankind.
Yeah, I like that. That sounds good. Um, do you find any credence in the notion of the Anunnaki or the Annuna utilizing and kind of using humanity to mine gold? I've heard that before. As I don't know if Sitchin is the one that kind of references that, but do you find any credence in that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's all Sitchin-esque stuff. That was his premise. That was his big reason of why. Because everybody's like, well, the Anunnaki came here apparently, but like, why? What was their purpose? So Sitchin's why was that their planet Nibiru was dying, its atmosphere was dying, and that they came here to search for gold in Africa, and to smash it down to powder form and then throw it up in their atmosphere to protect their planet from radiation, which is actually like a very smart thing that even like NASA has proposed before. Um, but there are a lot of weird things when it comes to that. Like, for example, apparently we have found mines in Africa, like mine shafts that go back like 40,000 years, or some even older than that. And it's just stories of gods. I mean, let's just take a look at money, for example, right? I mean, gold has always been regarded as valuable, but why? Why? I mean, other than the fact that it's shiny and it looks cool and it has some good uses for technology, why? Right? I mean, our ancestors weren't using it for technology; they were just using it for coins and for crowns and this and that. But when you ask these ancient people why do you love gold so much, for example, as Sitchin states in his Lost Realms book, which is about the Americas, when the colonizers, the Spanish conquistadors, went to the Americas and found all this gold, um, they asked them what gold, like, the word that used for gold translated as the god's tears. So gold has always been regarded as something of valuable, but the reason why, when we ask native people why, it's they always say, well, it's for the gods. The gods, the gold is reserved for the gods. This is their metal. This is for them. We're saving it for them for when they come back. So when you take that stuff into consideration, it's like, apparently the gods did come here for minerals, maybe not just gold, maybe other things, but what they used it for, what they were planning on doing with it, I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you have any thoughts on the concept of mana and what that may have been in reference to?
Yeah, so manna comes from like the biblical story of the Jews wandering in the desert, and then it was just like a miraculous food, or this miraculous substance that every morning it would grow like dew. I guess it was metaphorically stated as like dew. It would, every morning the Jews would wake up when they were wandering in the desert, and this manna was growing, and then they would eat it, and it would sustain them. Some people have said it was mushrooms. I've heard that theory, that it was psychedelic mushrooms. And then people like Gerald Clark, RIP, who was also a Sitchin scholar, uh, said that mana was actually monatomic gold. And monatomic gold is a edible form of gold, which can sustain the cellular structure of our body. And if it is alchemically produced to such a pristine level, apparently monatomic gold can kind of keep you alive for a really, really, really long time.
Yeah, I think that would be possibly the reason why it would be so valuable to the Anuna, probably, if that was the case.
Yeah,
Um, yeah. So let's talk about your book on Lucifer. I think that this is really important discussion right now because I see it as like a huge sort of mass hypnotic, fear-based indoctrination type collective thought form or like egregore that people just perpetuate and they don't really question or want to discuss generally, or they kind of just avoid altogether. So it's just really cool that you wrote a book on this subject because it's kind of like one of those things that some people just avoid even looking at it. But I'm glad that you did, and I think you make a lot of good points. So yeah, let's maybe just get into it and touch on kind of your general overview of what your book is and what is it about, and yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, so I started writing the book a couple years ago, and I've always had a relationship with Christianity all throughout my life, and so it's always kind of the center point of my studies. It started there, and then I've kind of branched off, and I wanted to write this book for various reasons. I wanted to make it as academic as possible to provide a new, uh, some new unique perspectives on the subject to help academia and education further along in that subject. But also, I had a more fanatical goal in mind, and that was to break the paradigms, to deconstruct the indoctrination that both the church and the occultism has, because both of them were, hold Lucifer in high regards for different reasons. As you said, some of it's fear. The church uses Satan and Lucifer for this fear-based indoctrination, and then the occult uses Lucifer for like this rebellious, a liberating aspect, which is cool, for everybody's open to their opinion and what they want to do with themselves. But I wanted to deconstruct both of them and show that Lucifer is a fantasy. He's a fictitious character, and so that we can get over this, so that we can move forward as a planetary community. And it's a small but humble goal, because we're up against a lot in this life, and up against a lot with all these debating ideologies and philosophies. But any, chipping away, at all of this, I think is really what I'm trying to do, is just slowly chip away at indoctrination, so that one day we can live honest and yeah, be honest and mature with each other, about what it is we believe and what's going on and who our ancestors are and what we are. But so the book is an academic perspective on the historicity of Lucifer. And what I found upon my research was that the Western world was introduced to Lucifer primarily through the English version, the King James Bible. And it was used as an uppercase pronoun or name in that version only once, in the famous Isaiah 14:12 verse, "O Lucifer, how art thou fallen?" But we got that incorrectly translated. So from the English, it came from the Latin, and from the Greek, and then from the Hebrew. And I'm gonna kind of just break this thing down. So if you want to interrupt or say anything, just let me know. But so it comes from the Latin, from the Greek, from the Hebrew. And in the original Hebrew, where we would see Lucifer, we would see Hallel ben Shahar. And Hallel was the name of a Canaanite deity, and the name itself means bright. And then, of course, Hallel ben Shahar means Hallel, son of Shahar. Shahar was also a Canaanite deity, and Shahar means dawn. That's what the name of what the meaning of the name is. So that's how we got, Lucifer, or bright son of the morning. And we properly translated that into the Greek, where we would see Lucifer today. In the Greek, we would see phosphorus, which means fire or light, but it was used as a lowercase adjective. And then in the Latin, we properly translated it as Lucifer, because Lucifer is a Latin word, but again, it was used as a lowercase, and the lowercase Lucifer word is derived from two root words, lus and fere, which means light and to bring or to hold. So that's where we got the occult concept of Lucifer being the light bringer. And then when we translated the Latin to the English, that's when we got it all messed up. That's when we changed Lucifer to an uppercase L, and then now we only used it one time in the famous Isaiah 14:12 verse, and now it changes the whole context. Now we see Lucifer as a character. It's given its own character name. And there are other things that we need to take into consideration. For example, Isaiah was a prophet and a scribe, an intelligent and educated one at that. So he was aware of the old world mythologies. He was aware of his history. And when he was writing his stuff, around 600 BC, the Babylonians were descending upon the Judean kingdom. And so he was prophesizing the downfall of the Babylonian enslavers. And so in Isaiah 14:12, he's not talking about a Lucifer. He's writing this towards the Babylonian kings, condemning them, prophesizing their downfall. And he uses different metaphors. Hallel is actually the name of an old Canaanite deity by the name of Athtar. And Athtar, in a couple Canaanite texts, tried to ascend to the throne, to Baal's throne, actually, but it was deemed that he wasn't fit to rule. And Athtar is actually a male rendition of Astarte, Ishtar, and the Sumerian Inanna, who were all goddesses, very important goddesses, who for some reason was, for a short time, reimagined as a male Athtar. Now, both Astarte, and Hallel, all being bright, the word bright, are also words that can represent Venus. And Venus, in its celestial mythology, is that it is the brightest celestial object in the sky, in the morning sky, preceding the sun. I mean, you see this, you can see this with your eye or with a telescope, depending on where you are in the world. So Isaiah, being in the ancient times, was writing this polemical insult or prophecy towards the Babylonian kings using these metaphors, saying, you guys think that you're like Athtar, like Hallel, or like Venus, that you are something of importance, but you will soon be overshadowed by the sun or God.
Wow, yeah, it's just so fascinating. I love the way that you break it all down like that. It's really informative. Um, so what are your thoughts on modern terminology? Like people like take like Luciferianism. You'll hear people say so and so is Luciferian or something along those lines. In that context, what do you think that they're referring to? And I guess has like the word's kind of been hijacked in that sense, possibly. But yeah, just curious, like what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think when people accuse other people of being Luciferian, for one, they're either saying that they're like occultic or satanic, or in the more less aggressive usage of it, they're just saying that they're spiritual, but like in a rebellious way towards the church or towards mainstream authority, right? And because the story of Lucifer, as it was weaved together by the early church and then taken by the occult and philosophized, is that Lucifer was this glorious angel, and then, risked his position in heaven to come down here and give us knowledge. So a Luciferian would be somebody who believes that knowledge or consciousness overrides indoctrination, right? So somebody who says, well, the church is evil and we shouldn't pay attention to the church, we should pay attention to science or knowledge or spirituality, can be perceived as Luciferian. I don't believe that Lucifer is real, right? I mean, that's what I try to show with my book, and he is real, if I'm being honest, if we're being honest academically. But as I've said before in other shows, just because he was never a real character in the Bible doesn't mean he's not real as an archetype, right? Because and that's when we start getting into psychology, the subconscious, quantum physics, and stuff like that. I mean, that's when we start getting into like what is real, what is reality, what is simulation. um, but so although Lucifer was never an actual character in the Bible, as I show throughout the book, that if there ever was a Lucifer in our history, it was Enki, because of the Garden of Eden story and his rivalry with his brother Enlil, and his sympathy towards humanity, and him being the god of wisdom and actually being represented as a serpent. Um, but the fallen angel aspect of it kind of got coupled with it and weaved in there with the Book of Enoch story and the Nephilim, and then the church and the occult kind of threw some fuel in the fire with certain things like Baphomet, right? Eliphas Levi's Baphomet illustration, the church, and some more Christian-esque New Agers would say that Baphomet is like a satanic or Luciferian image. So it's just this whole thing of like playing telephone, or it's just this whole conundrum of us misunderstanding and mistranslating, and also even worse than that, adding our own opinion, our own philosophies about these things. For example, Dante's Inferno. Dante Alighieri, the famous literary writer who wrote the Inferno, which is like to this day by some churches, some Catholic churches, regarded as like fact. But Dante wrote that purposefully as a fictional biography on what he was experiencing in his time. So when it comes to the fallen angel thing, the story of the fallen angels comes from the Book of Enoch, but it also goes all the way back to Zoroastrianism, and also goes all the way back to the Anunnaki and their rivalries, and the idea of them being beings that descended here. So there is some truth to it, but it's just more complex than your local church would want you to believe.
Yeah, I just think it's so funny because it's like embedded in the consciousness, kind of. It's like that's what you think of when you, I mean, generally speaking.
Yeah.
I think maybe it'd be cool to touch on uh, Satanism, maybe Satan, what that is, how that differentiates, and then the devil as well, because those are, I mean, those three, those are like the things that you would associate with each other, I think. And then so it'd be cool to talk about and include those as well and kind of differentiate.
Yes, absolutely. So I separate Lucifer and Satan, as many people do in the occult. It's understood within the occult that Satan and Lucifer are two different characters. And the history, though, of Satan and its etymology and its concept is similar to Lucifer. In the original Old Testament, some of the earlier versions, Satan was used as like an adjective, a lowercase word for an adversary. But more or less, some people have like explained it as like he was God's like lawyer, right? The earlier concept of Satan was that he was actually employed by God to instigate, to test people. He was never like the all-encompassing ruler of evil and hell. That didn't come till way later. So Satan was actually um, God's helper. He was helping God. He was employed by God to do his job, which was to instigate and test people. And that concept was later evolved to an uppercase Satan, where now he is this encompassing ruler. And there's different reasons for that. Um, it's apparent that Judaism has actually borrowed and was influenced by Zoroastrianism. So Zoroastrianism precedes Judaism by 1,000 years. It was an old Persian religion, and it was started by the legendary Zoroaster or Zarathustra. And when prior to Zoroastrianism, the old Persian world, the old Middle East was polytheistic, and he came to redeem that. He came to change that and create a new uniform monotheistic religion. It's kind of the same prophet story. Zoroaster grew up in a priest family, and then when he was like later older, he had like a vision, and some angel came and visited him and told him, gave him this new doctrine and told him to go preach it, which was this monotheistic doctrine where Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, was the one and only God. But in Zoroastrianism, there are other little gods, and there are also demons. And there's Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, and then there's Angra Mainyu, the evil Lord. And so Zoroastrianism was very dualistic. There was a good, there was an evil, but not like Judaism or Christianity. It didn't preach like you must follow the good Lord or you're gonna die. It was, or go to hell or whatever. It was more like you have the choice, like it's your choice. And Zoroastrianism is actually responsible for like the Judgment Day idea, the end times idea, the idea of a Messiah. So what I'm getting at is philosophically speaking, yes, God and Satan are kind of these dualistic forces, but are really the one, because if God is all encompassing, he must have created evil. So it's one and the same. But the actual historical truth is that that idea of God and Satan was influenced by Zoroastrianism.
Earlier you had mentioned that liberating aspect of the idea of Lucifer, and I had listened to I think it was a Rudolf Steiner thing sort of recently, and I think that he was deriving some of his information from Zoroastrian knowledge, but I think the way he was explaining it was with his conception of the force, what he would say, the Luciferic force, and I think he related that to kind of like a liberating uh, force or something along those lines. And then there was the Ahrimanic uh, end of the spectrum that was kind of like this rigid, fixated sort of force. So the way he was describing it was one was on one end of the spectrum, the other on the other, and then the idea of Christ in the middle. And I was I'm not sure if if Lucifer or what that force was actually named as or referenced within Zoroastrianism, or if he just kind of made those connections and then used that word to describe it. But from your research and your knowledge, is there some kind of link there that you could make?
Yeah. So Zoroastrianism was like highly regarded as like the source of occult knowledge in the classical occult age, like from the 1800s to like the 1900s, because we had not yet uncovered the Sumerians, right? Like, for example, I touch on Blavatsky and Levi in my book. And I like to say Levi, Eliphas Levi, was the bridge between Christianity and the occult. He was that bridge, what really started to set off the occult. And he wrote about Lucifer and kind of started to set up the Luciferian doctrines that later Blavatsky and Steiner and the many other occultists would add to. But there, but again, Lucifer was concocted out of the early church, early Christian era. Prior to the Christian era, there was no Lucifer. There was only Hillel ben Shahar, right? But so Steiner's philosophizing, as many of the cultists do and have done. But Ahriman that he meant, the Ahriman he mentioned is actually the later shortened version of Angra Mainyu. So in the early Zoroastrian teachings, there was Ahura Mazda and then Angra Mainyu. And then later on, like modern Zoroastrianism, they've shortened the names to Ormazd. So there's Ormazd, and then there's Ahriman. And Ahriman is kind of like the more like you stated, the devilish character, this demonic devil character that's just hell bent. And then Lucifer, philosophically speaking, is kind of like this anti-hero that's not necessarily Ahriman, but isn't necessarily Ahura Mazda either. He's like this free agent that just brings you knowledge, and it's up to you to do with it what you want.
All right, interesting. And yeah, it's cool you brought up Eliphas Levi. It's funny because like back in the day, like I wouldn't even consider looking at Eliphas Levi because it was just so mysterious to me, and there was like the Baphomet thing, and for whatever reason I had it in my head that I shouldn't even like consider it. But I came across this audiobook called the Paradoxes of Science or something along those lines that he wrote, and holy shit, I mean he's a genius writer, and I was like, I like this dude. And then there's, I think you're probably aware of the whole like misconception with the Baphomet thing. Maybe that would be cool to kind of like touch on.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually have a documentary out on him on my YouTube channel, Esoteric Eddie TV. Yeah, I'm fascinated by him. I always say, like, I think somebody should make a movie on him and his life. His fascinating story, just a lot of ups and downs, love and heartbreaks, and murder and imprisonment, all kinds of stuff. But yeah, so he grew up as a Catholic within the church and was very good at what he did as far as being like clerical and knowing the Bible and preaching. So he had a set up life within the church to be an ordained priest, but he just couldn't shake his occult, or at that time just spiritual thoughts, and his writings on God and on love were just way too psychedelic for the church. So eventually he was given like an ultimatum, stop writing these things about God and love and this and that, or we're going to excommunicate you. And so he chose his health, he chose his writings and his heart. So he was excommunicated and went off to live this troubling life for some time, being homeless, being imprisoned by the government a couple times for his writings on God and love and liberation. And he just felt like the church was just too mundane, too robot like. They weren't actually expressing God's love. They were just expressing this Ahramanic, institution of just like subjugating themselves and their souls. But so he drew the Baphomet image later on, and for him, it was never meant to be demonic, never meant to be taken in that consideration. But it was meant to be daunting, something that captivates you in an unsure way. And what you're looking at, as he explains, is an amalgamation of spiritual symbolism. And the reason he used the goat's head is because that symbolizes man's beast nature. And the reason why we don't like looking at it, maybe on a subconscious level, is because we resonate that. It's a mirror, right? It's a mirror to our own selves, and the flame protruding above the beast's head is actually supposed to be the soul rising above matter, rising above the physical realm. And so it's a meditative image that's supposed to get you to ascend the physical realm and the physical prejudices and try to find a higher purpose.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, he was definitely really good at pointing out the ironies of the church and some of the texts that I had listened to, and he did it with just an amazing vocabulary and the way that he described things. So he's definitely up there for me. Um, but man, I there's a bunch of stuff I wanted to get to. We got to close this out, but I
Yeah,
hope I can hopefully have you back on because I wanted to touch on some of your kind of paranormal experiences because you got some really
yeah,
interesting stuff with that as well. But maybe we could do another one in the future. But before we sign off, maybe you could just direct people. Well, first, if you have any last messages or anything that you just want to put out there, and then you can say whatever you want, and then after that, maybe you could put out like where people could find your book, and then find out more about you and your research and all that.
yeah. I think on this wave that we're on right now is just that sigils or symbols which represent knowledge are kind of represent the level of understanding that you have. So if you ever come across something, a symbol or knowledge that resonates hesitancy within you or fear within you, that's only because you have not yet to understand it. And we really overcome fear and gain power in this life, spiritual power, by understanding things. So I just want to say, let us keep learning. Let us not be afraid to peer into things and learn things and study things so that we can become powerful and more accountable in our responsibilities as a community. And with that being said, you can find me on Instagram at Esoteric Eddie, YouTube at Esoteric Eddie TV, and I do have a bit shoot at Esoteric Eddie TV. I kind of just use that as a backup for things that YouTube won't allow me to post. But definitely Instagram and YouTube are like my main sources if you want to hook up or just keep up to date.
Excellent. Well, you're awesome, man, and I really appreciate you and appreciate the work that you're doing. So yeah, I just want to thank you again for coming on my podcast and sharing your information, and let's do another one eventually. So
Absolutely, man. Thank you.